One of the more underrated features of the way we govern in the US is what Justice Louis Brandeis called the laboratories of democracy. When fallible humans set rules for other fallible humans to live by, it's most likely that the behavior that emerges ends up being a lot different than what the rule setters had in mind when they set the rules. So the benefit of governing at a state level as much as possible is that we get 50 different experiments in rule setting that can help us distinguish good rules from bad rules. This is a principle of Catholic social thought called subsidiarity, that is, govern at the lowest possible level. And when you do that, you create amongst the political entities the same sort of competition that exists among businesses in the marketplace, and that same dynamic that encourages businesses to continually reform and improve what they're doing, that then starts to work in the political sphere as well. With alcohol control, we now have years of experimentation. We have states that have run the gamut from monopolizing both the retail and wholesale markets for alcohol to monopolizing the wholesale market and only part of the retail market, to monopolizing the wholesale market and not the retail market, to monopolizing neither. And so we have this suite of experiments in alcohol control. This has given economists a tremendous data set to look at and compare how these different laboratories are performing with regard to the efficacy of their rule setting. And if the problem's not complicated enough when you think about alcohol control, when you think about efficacy, it becomes even more complicated. There are studies that have looked at the effect of alcohol control on alcohol consumption, the idea being that less alcohol consumption is considered more efficacious. There are studies that look at alcohol-related deaths, and of course, fewer alcohol-related deaths are considered more efficacious. There are studies that look at alcohol-related vehicle deaths, distinguished from alcohol-involved vehicle deaths, and there's a distinction between these two. Some have looked at underage drinking, some have looked at underage binge drinking. So we have this suite of studies that are applied to this suite of experiments in alcohol control. Taken as a whole, at best, the results indicate that there isn't really a compelling connection between state control and efficacious outcomes. At worst, there is a hint of a suggestion that under certain circumstances, more heavier state control is actually associated with worse outcomes, which of course is the opposite of what we would hope. What we do know from the research is that the link between alcohol controls and efficacy is fraught with uncertainties and contradictions. In short, it's complicated. So I'd be happy to provide I have a nice summary of the research that shows what people have looked at and what results they've come to, but I'll give you just some highlights. A study of 111 California cities found that an increase in the density of off-site licenses, that is, more establishments per square mile that sell alcohol to be consumed off premises. The more you get of that, of course, the knee-jerk reaction is you would assume that you get more density, you'll have more alcohol-related problems. And in fact, what they find in this California study is that the higher density is actually associated with a decline in fatal alcohol-related vehicle accidents. Now, conversely, it's also associated with an increase in non-fatal accidents, right? As if the higher density encourages people who have had a bit to go drive to the store and come home, and some of them are in accidents, but the higher density meaning they have greater access to alcohol, so once they have enough, they just stay home, and so you don't get the fatal accidents, right? I don't know how to interpret that, but this is one of these examples of the somewhat contradictory results you get. A study of drinking habits amongst public university students found that increased density of retail establishments was associated with an increase in self-reported alcohol consumption. Now here you have a problem that you have with many of these studies. When it comes to self-reporting of alcohol consumption, you're going to get a bias on both sides. On one side, people who are going to tend to report less alcohol consumption, either from shame or embarrassment or what have you, and others, through self-aggrandizement, are going to report more alcohol consumption than what they actually have. On top of that, you've got a causality problem here. It's not enough to say, well, if you have more retail establishments, you'll also have college students who drink more. The natural assumption is that what that result tells us is greater density of retail establishments cause more drinking, when in fact, it could very well be the other way around. In fact, in some sense, it might make more sense it's the other way around, that if you have a concentration of people who are heavy alcohol consumers, the market will follow. And of course, you'll tend to get a higher density of retail establishments. Studies of alcohol privatization, there are a number of states, Maine, Alabama, West Virginia, several others, that over the course of the past 30, 40 years have gone from a position of heavy alcohol control to much less alcohol control, to privatization. And what a number of studies have found is that when you privatize the alcohol sales, wine sales rise, but beer and liquor sales don't. And researchers have found that in Maine and Alabama. Another study in West Virginia found the opposite, that when you privatize, beer sales go up, but wine and liquor sales don't. And then to further add to the confusion, subsequent studies showed that the increase in wine sales that the previous studies found were only temporary. That if you run time forward long enough, what you find is that the privatization was associated with an increase in wine consumption, and then within about 3, 4, 5 years, the wine consumption drops back down to the level it was at prior to the privatization. A colleague and I attacked this problem, and unlike previous studies that have tended to classify states as control states or not control states, we looked at a suite of controls. So we look at the gamut from low control to lighter control to moderate to heavy control, and ask the question, if you divide the states this way, by degree of control, rather than a binary, we control alcohol versus we don't, and compare it to outcomes, what do you find? And what we found in this study was no clear relationship between the degree of control and the outcomes, with a possible exception, that control of wholesale markets, depending on what efficacious outcome you're looking at, control of wholesale markets by the state on occasion exhibited better outcomes than either control of retail and wholesale markets or control of neither. Now, I'll come back to that in a moment. The conclusion that I would leave you with is this. As with all regulations, if we treat the government as a magic wand, we're not going to get the outcomes we expect. It's incentives, not legislation, that alter people's behavior. For example, monopolizing in state-controlled retail sales and then instructing state employees not to sell to minors ignores incentives. But licensing a private retailer and then telling the private retailer that you'll lose your license if you sell to minors does co-opt incentives. And a good example of this is Colorado. And it's not alcohol, it's marijuana. Colorado, as you know, legalized marijuana. And if you look at studies of underage marijuana consumption, they've been falling steadily since marijuana was legalized. Now, that's counterintuitive until you step back and realize that with marijuana now being legal, entrepreneurs have the ability to invest significant amounts of money in marijuana shops, which they do. The license to which they will lose if they're caught selling to minors. So all of a sudden, there's a tremendous, you've co-opted the profit incentive to give the sellers the incentive not to sell to minors. And in fact, if you look at Colorado now, it's typical that you walk into a place and there's a thing, you walk in the door and you're caught here because the door is locked and you have to show your ID. They won't even let you into the store if you're a minor. This is the extent to which these retailers are protecting the investment they've made. So the long and short of the whole thing is, I would, as an economist, caution you in waving government as a magic wand, in thinking that legislation is going to achieve the outcomes you want, but rather thinking carefully about the incentives that the legislation creates and thinking about how people will respond to those incentives.